Today I'm reading from Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. I'm beginning to read Chapter 4, The Self, paragraph 43. We shall now turn to the question of whether the increase in self-knowledge resulting from the withdrawal of impersonal projections, in other words, the integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. To the extent that the integrated contents are parts of the self, we can expect this influence to be considerable. Their assimilation augments not only the area of the field of consciousness, but also the importance of the ego, especially when, as usually happens, the ego lacks any critical approach to the unconscious. In that case, it is easily overpowered and becomes identical with the contents that have been assimilated. In this way, for instance, a masculine consciousness comes under the influence of the anima and can even be possessed by her. Paragraph 44. I have discussed the wide effects of the integration of unconscious contents elsewhere, and can therefore omit going into details here. I should only like to mention that the more numerous and the more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. This inevitably produces an inflation of the ego, unless a critical line of demarcation is drawn between it and the unconscious figures. But this act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego and in granting the figures of the unconscious, the self, anima, animus, and shadow, relative autonomy and reality of a psychic nature. To psychologize this reality out of existence either is ineffectual or else merely increases the inflation of the ego. One cannot dispose of facts by declaring them unreal. The projection-making factor, for instance, has undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it, which is not only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well-being of the individual. Everyone who has dealings with such cases knows how perilous an inflation can be. No more than a flight of steps or a smooth floor is needed to precipitate a fatal fall. Before the pride goeth before a fall motif, there are other factors of a no less disagreeable psychosomatic and psychic nature which serve to reduce puff-uppedness. This condition should not be interpreted as one of conscious self-aggrandizement. Such is far from being the rule. In general, we are not directly conscious of this condition at all, but can at best infer its existence indirectly from the symptoms. These include the reactions of our immediate environment. Inflation magnifies the blind spot in the eye, and the more we are assimilated by the projection-making factor, the greater becomes the tendency to identify with it. A clear symptom of this is our growing disinclination to take note of the reactions of the environment and pay heed to them. Paragraph 45. It must be recognized as psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand it shares the archaic nature of the unconscious, and on the other finds itself in the psychically relative space-time continuum that is characteristic of the unconscious as such. Both these qualities are numinous and hence have an unlimited determining effect on ego consciousness, which is differentiated, i.e. separated from the unconscious and moreover exists in an absolute space and absolute time. It is a vital necessity that this should be so, If, therefore, the ego falls for any length of time under the control of an unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way opened for all sorts of possible accidents. Paragraph 46. Hence it is of the greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. Paragraph 47. However, accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized and the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it is followed by the same result, inflation. The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal, and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for the dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. In the first case, mobilization of all of the virtues is indicated. In the second, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by a moral defeat. This is necessary because otherwise one will never attain that median degree of modesty which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. For instance, a man who is not conscientious enough has to make a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, while for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts, it is no small moral achievement to inflict defeat on his virtues by loosening his ties with the world and reducing his adaptive performance. One thinks in this connection of Brother Klaus, now canonized, who for the salvation of his soul left his wife to her own devices along with numerous progeny. Paragraph 48. Since real moral problems all begin where the penal code leaves off, their solution can seldom or never depend on precedent, much less on precepts and commandments. The real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty. Anyone who is sufficiently humble or easygoing can always reach a decision with the help of some outside authority, but one who trusts others as little as himself can never reach a decision at all unless it is brought about in the manner which common law calls an act of God. The Oxford Dictionary defines this concept as the action of uncontrollable natural forces. In all such cases, there is an unconscious authority which puts an end to doubt by creating a fait accompli. In the last analysis, this is true also of those who get their decision from a higher authority, only in more veiled form. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces, though psychologically it makes a good deal of difference how one thinks of it. The rationalistic interpretation of this inner authority as natural forces or the instincts satisfies the modern intellect, but has the great disadvantage that the apparent victory of instinct offends our moral self-esteem. Hence, we like to persuade ourselves that the matter has been decided solely by the rational motions of the will. Civilized man has such a fear of this that whenever possible, he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feeling of having suffered a moral defeat. He prides himself on what he believes to be his self-control and the omnipotence of his will, and despises the man who lets himself be outwitted by mere nature.